It is a truth universally acknowledged.
I myself have noticed my growing resemblance
all that is
to a
gold
daffodil.
does not glitter.
To how I would die.
Not all.
Though I had reason enough
living
in
and
the
suffering
last few
for you
months.
believe.
If you want to rebel from inside the system.
But because they tell us that dragons
I'm your
can
host
be
Vicky from Miss Vicky's Bookcase. Let's begin our story together. Hello and welcome. I couldn't decide whether I really wanted to do a Christmas book list this year. I did do one a couple of years ago and I did take it down so you can't see it anymore. But it seems every man and his dog is doing one of these lists. And there are so many out there that I thought, what could be different? And I thought suddenly, well, what is the perfect Christmas book? And the book that immediately came to my mind was The Christmas Carol. So we're going to have a little look at The Christmas Carol today, and I'm going to have a little dive into why I think The Christmas Carol is a perfect book. Now don't worry, if you have a totally different opinion, feel free to leave it in the comments below if you're on YouTube, or to message me at Miss Vicky's Bookcase on Instagram if you're listening to the podcast elsewhere. So, just in case you haven't heard of The Christmas Carol, it was first published in 1843 on the 19th of December and was sold out by Christmas Eve of that same year, so it was very, very popular. This is all about a man called Ebenezer Scrooge and how miserly he was and how he came to become a different person. So that's it, just in a 30-second nutshell. Now, the question we should be asking ourselves is, why is it a perfect Christmas book? Actually, it's two questions really, because before we answer that question, we've got to ask ourselves another question, and that is, what do you think of when you think of Christmas? Now, ignoring the gifts, because everybody gets gifts mostly at Christmas, and what we're really thinking about is what Christmas embodies. And when I think of Christmas, I think of kindness, goodwill to man, redemption, peace and love. It's one of those times a year where everyone comes together and there is a spirit of mutual togetherness, if that makes sense, that even if you aren't a religious person and celebrating the birth of Christ, is one of those things where it's just that symbolic togetherness that it brings you closer to other people, which I think is a brilliant thing, whether you celebrate Christmas as a Christian or if you celebrate Christmas in a different way. Everyone seems to have this goodwill and good cheer, and I think that's especially applicable when this is the darkest part of the year, where everyone's feeling dark and depressed. You don't get much sun unless of course you're in Australia or other warm places like that, and you kind of need that upliftment. So now that we know what we're kind of thinking of when it comes to Christmas, we're going to go back to The Christmas Carol and why Christmas Carol is that perfect Christmas book. And we're going to start with Scrooge himself as a great reason that The Christmas Carol is a perfect book. Now, we start off the book, of course, with a man called Ebenezer Scrooge, and if you say that name or use it in a normal conversation practically anywhere in the world, anybody else will know what you mean when you say that person's a Scrooge or bar humbug, because he has become this embodiment of mean, arrogant, stingy, unloving, unfeeling, ungenerous. But there is that certain something still inside him, that tiniest of sparks, that means he is not completely irredeemable or unsavable. And I think a lot of people like the fact that you can have that kind of character where he's almost unredeemable, he's not going to change, and yet he still can. There's always a possibility. And I think that can be applied to practically any character in the fictional world, that there is that spark, there is that possibility for redemption. And I think pretty much most people like that. I don't remember if there's anyone really who likes they're not going to be redeemed ever, and it's a one-dimensional character. And this makes Scrooge the perfect character for being the central character, so to speak, in the book, because the core theme of the book is all about transformation, and Scrooge is an excellent example of what happens if we embodied Scrooge's personality and how people feel and think about Scrooge, which leads nicely on to my next point about the use of the past, present and future in the book. And I think this is a really good idea because it's kind of ghostly. Okay, they are ghosts, they're spirits, they're ghosts, and I really kind of like that. It's not a spooky ghost like you'd find in October for Halloween and that kind of thing. It gives it that supernatural element, as if they needed a real intervention, because it feels like Scrooge is having an intervention, so to speak, in modern parlance. And I feel like this is so well done because it gives the opportunity for Charles Dickens to have a look at the past, present and future of Scrooge without being bogged down with too much detail. And that's what I particularly like, especially as you can see when we go to the past, how he was like as a child and how these things influenced him to become the man he is in the present. And he can actually take a step outside of himself and kind of look at how people see him in the present, which is again something we don't often see in a lot of things. And it kind of gives that nice symmetry into how his life could be. So past, present and future. And I really like the future as well, because it gives him that opportunity to see himself from a future point of view, and the fact that he could change and he has that rare opportunity to see the future. And it's weird, I kind of want that myself. Sometimes I really want to see kind of what happens so I could know and change my mind about certain things. I think that's just the perfectionist in me that just wants to know if I'm taking a right path for doing specific things. But it's something that's really rare, and the fact that he uses this to change himself for the better, to me, is such a good thing. And again, it's that transformation of someone who is mean and horrible to someone who has a complete attitude change just in the blink of an eye almost. And although some people might seem unrealistic, I can't help but thinking actually no, I think it is very realistic. If you had 3 ghosts visit you, I think you might want to change as well into being a good person, especially if you can see how people have some attitude about you in the future, especially if they're stealing the very clothes off your back when you're dead, which is what happens to poor Scrooge in that future. And it just really, I think, pulls at the heartstrings as you see him transfer from bad to good. And again, I think it's a perfect use of the past, present and future and the ghosts and the spirits, and making it almost unearthly, which I have thoroughly enjoyed throughout the book. Now, this kind of leads me on a little bit to my next reason why I really love this as the perfect Christmas book, and that is happiness, which sounds a bit weird, but bear with me on this. And it's kind of really the attitude of a couple of people in the book that really get to me, not in a bad way, but in a really good way. So first of all, we're going to have a look at Scrooge's nephew Frank. He is the only son of a beloved sister, because Scrooge really did love his sister, and that again shows a spark of he's not irredeemable. Anyway, so Frank is a great example how to live our lives, and his attitude is great. He goes to see his uncle and he offers him to come to Christmas dinner, and when we see him when he's being visited by Scrooge by the ghost of Christmas Present, we see that he still has this really great attitude. The fact that even though Scrooge said no and he knows that he's a mean person, he is going to persist in inviting Scrooge every single Christmas to Christmas dinner, because eventually Scrooge has got to give in. That's his attitude. Scrooge is going to give in. He's going to come and see him, and they're going to build a relationship. And I really like the fact that he seems persistent, that he knows that Scrooge may never change his mind, but he always wants to give the opportunity for him to change it. Now, the other people I wanted to mention in this is the family of Cratchits, who are poor and I would say very meek in spirit, and they are generally content with what they've got. They're not displeased with what they have, even though, say, the goose was small, and they're not going to have a richness that most people have. But they were content and they were happy to be with each other's company, and they were celebrating that. And I really, really like that. I also kind of like the fact that Dickens doesn't turn the Cratchits into what I want to call the noble poor, if that makes sense. There's this kind of weird ideal imaginary that if you're poor, then you of course are noble because you can't help yourself, that you are to be saved, and it's all kind of weird. But thankfully Dickens doesn't do that. Instead, he's more along the lines of they're just there and they kind of show a different side, especially to the audience, because Dickens was writing to a middle class audience, so they of course wouldn't know very much about the poor, which I'll get to in a minute, because I'm just going to jump back to Scrooge's happiness and his happiness when he realizes that he's alive and that he could do something. And it's quite infectious, really, because when you're listening to the end, you're very much uplifted and it's a very enjoyable sensation, if that makes sense, and it kind of makes you want to do something yourself. For me, it personally reminds me that charity never faileth and that we can be generous with charity, and it doesn't have to be money. If we're talking in a modern sense, there are many other ways you can give, which could include the giving of your time, whether it be volunteering to run a youth group, helping with respite retreats, helping your neighbour. There is always something you can do. And if you're stuck for ideas, I'll leave a link to the website in the show notes below so you know where you can have a starting point if you want to volunteer for something. Anyway, moving on. So this kind of leads nicely with charity into the next one, which is a social plight. And I found it really interesting that Dickens used this story to bring the social plight of the poor, and especially the poor children, to the notice of the middle class of the time. And that again is really good because it shows it in a very gentle way that's not overpowering, and the plight of those people who do not have enough. And this again is shown in the Cratchit family, where the oldest daughter is already working long hours and very little time off. But we also have the two allegories, want and ignorance, shown in the book, and again that's an easy way to get people to see that if you're ignorant about what happens with the poor and the needy, then you need to stop being ignorant. And this is kind of the attitude that Scrooge has right at the beginning, because he's basically saying, well, if there's poor, then they can go to the workhouse, they can go be in prison, they can have this and that. And he doesn't really want to give anything because he thinks the poor are already looked after. Again, this goes back a little bit to the noble poor situation, and I'm glad Dickens didn't do it that way. So it makes it a little bit more palatable to those who are actually reading this. And this is probably a great place to mention Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim, I think, is the embodiment of the child who is too poor to basically live too much longer. It sounds really harsh, but Tiny Tim is there to pull the heartstrings of the reader and to cause all the sympathy, because we all know that he is not really going to live without any help. And that sounds a really harsh thing to say, but we all know that he is a very sick child, and most children who are sick when they are poor and have no access to any medical care, this is not going to end well for Tiny Tim if something isn't done for him. So we have that kind of little bit of a theme going on, and this is a job well done again in my mind, because he hasn't, Dickens that is, hasn't alienated the reader by having Tiny Tim. He's there just specifically to pull at the heart, and yeah, to me that's a very good job well done, because he's a very gentle child. He's almost a Mary Jane, if you've ever heard of the term, and that just means a perfect character with no flaws. I don't think he has that, because you don't have enough of his character to be able to see that, other than he is a gentle, generous child, and he is much beloved, which I think is a lovely thing. So this brings us to my last point, and that is nostalgia. Let's be honest, The Christmas Carol is a total nostalgia fest. Whether it be The Muppet Christmas Carol, Scrooged, or just a reread, there is something about it that is ultimately timeless, and it has a certain something that we all want at Christmas. Not the Scrooge ghostly parts, but a glimpse of happy people at Christmas. And I think that's what we all want to have, really, is a happy Christmas where we celebrate, have joy. And if we go back to the definition of what we thought of the Christmas spirit, we kind of want peace and goodwill on earth. It's that special time where so many special things happen. And I'm going to use the word miracle, because there are so many stories of miracles happening at Christmas which do tug at the heartstrings. And it is there that the Christmas Carol lies. It tugs at the heartstrings, it brings you peace and good joy, it enthuses you to be generous and charitable, and to have those goodwill feelings towards men, which is why I think it is a perfect Christmas book, because it is the embodiment of what I feel the Christmas spirit to be. If you have a different opinion, please feel free to leave it in the comments below if you're on the YouTube channel, or if you are on one of the podcasts, feel free to message me on Instagram at Miss Vicky's Bookcase and let me know what your favourite one is, or if you think there is something else that beats out The Christmas Carol as the perfect Christmas story. I'll be more than happy to hear about it, or even tell me what your favourite Christmas movie is. I have to say The Muppets Christmas Carol is my favourite Christmas themed movie, but there are other ones that do edge it out a little. I think my colleague once told me that Die Hard is the best Christmas movie, but of course that's not actually Christmassy. Anyway, I shall see you in the next podcast. I think the next podcast will be the last one for the year. I'm going to take a 2-week break and then we're going to come back in the new year. And of course, we're going to do the obligatory New Year, New You situation where we talk about some non-fiction books that could help you restart your new year. So I hope you'll be looking forward to that. And I will see you next week, hopefully for something else Christmassy and special. Bye!
Ankh-Morpork, Pearl of Cities.
People really are
This
like houses
is not
with vast rooms and tiny
Libraries
windows.
were full of ideas, perhaps the most dangerous and
She
powerful.
delighted in the smell of the ink, the rough feel of the paper.
Had commented once that Neil had a
Story that
gift
can
for
only
making
be
someone
enjoyed
want to
by
punch
children
him.
is not a good children's
Very
story.
weak-minded,
in the sight.
refused to be influenced by literature and poetry.